There is something about family that makes love and pain feel almost the same. Two sisters can grow up sharing everything, from the same bedroom to the same dreams, and still end up as strangers. This is the story of two women who let one moment of anger steal 17 years of their lives. And it all started with a piano. Delia and Corinne Park were born, just 2 years apart, in a small house on the outskirts of Seattle. Their childhood home was nothing fancy. It had creaky wooden floors, a kitchen that always smelled like their mother's cooking, and a living room that was too small for the massive piano sitting in its center. That piano was the heart of the house. It was a 1952 Steinway Grand, with keys that had turned slightly yellow with age, and a rich, warm sound that filled every corner of the home. Their mother, a retired piano teacher named Hedgen, had saved for nearly a decade to buy that instrument. She often told her daughters that the piano was not just wood and strings. It was a member of the family. She would sit at the bench every evening after dinner, her fingers moving gracefully across the keys, playing old songs that made the girls feel safe and loved. When the sisters were young, they would sit on either side of their mother, watching her hands with wide eyes, dreaming of the day they could play just like her. Hedgen taught both of her daughters to play. Delia, the older one, had a natural gift for it. Her fingers seemed to dance on the keys without effort, and she could memorize a piece after hearing it just once or twice. Corinne, though not as naturally talented, loved the piano even more. She practiced for hours every day, pouring her heart into every note. The two sisters often played duets together, their hands crossing over each other on the keyboard, laughing when they made mistakes. Those were the golden years. The sisters were more than siblings. They were best friends. They shared secrets under the covers at night, walked to school together every morning, and promised each other that nothing would ever come between them. But life has a way of breaking even the strongest promises. As the years passed, the sisters grew up and moved out of the family home. Delia got married first and settled in a neighborhood just a few miles away. Corinne followed a few years later, building her own family in a town about 12 miles from her sister. They visited their mother often, sitting around the old piano, laughing about their childhood memories. Hedgen was getting older, but her love for music never faded. She still played every evening, even when her fingers had grown stiff with age. Then, in the winter of 2005, Hedgen passed away. The grief hit both sisters hard. Their mother had been the glue that held the family together, the gentle presence that made everything feel whole. Without her, there was a painful emptiness that neither of them knew how to fill. The funeral was quiet and small, attended only by close family and a few old friends. The sisters held each other's hands during the service, tears streaming down their faces, silently promising to support one another through the pain. But grief does strange things to people. It can bring out the best in some and the worst in others. And sometimes it reveals cracks that were always there, hiding just beneath the surface. A few weeks after the funeral, the family gathered to discuss what would happen to Hedgen's belongings. Most of the decisions were easy. The old furniture would be donated. The photo albums would be divided evenly. The jewelry would go to the grandchildren when they were old enough. But when it came to the piano, everything fell apart. Both sisters wanted it. Delia argued that as the eldest, she should inherit the instrument. It was tradition, she said. Besides, she had been the more talented player, and she had a larger home with enough space for such a grand piano. Corinne felt a sharp sting at those words. She had always known that her sister was the gifted one. But hearing it spoken so plainly, especially at such a painful time, felt like a knife to the heart. Corinne argued that she deserved the piano because she had spent more time with their mother in her final years. While Delia had been busy with her career and her own family, Corinne had driven over every week to check on Hedgen, to cook for her, to sit beside her while she played. The piano held her memories, her sacrifices, her love. How could Delia claim it without acknowledging all of that? The argument grew heated. Words that should never have been spoken flew across the room. Delia accused Corinne of always being jealous. Corinne accused Delia of being selfish and cold. Years of small resentments, buried hurts, and unspoken frustrations came pouring out in a single afternoon. By the time the sun set that day, the sisters were no longer speaking. Lawyers got involved. The legal battle over the piano dragged on for months, turning a family matter into a bitter court case. In the end, the judge ruled in favor of Delia. As the firstborn, and with no clear written wishes from their mother, the piano went to her. Corinne was devastated. She felt like she had lost not only the piano, but also her sister, her childhood, and the last connection to her mother. After the ruling, Corinne sent Delia one final message. She said she never wanted to see her again. And for the next 17 years, she kept that promise. The two sisters lived just 12 miles apart, but they existed in completely different worlds. They did not call. They did not write. They did not attend each other's children's weddings or birthday parties. When family members tried to bring them together, both women refused. The wound was too deep, and neither one knew how to start healing it. Delia kept the piano in her living room, but she rarely played it anymore. Every time she looked at it, she felt a mix of guilt and sorrow. She had won the legal battle, but she had lost something far more precious. Some nights, she would sit at the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys, unable to bring herself to press them down. The music reminded her too much of her mother and of the sister she had pushed away. Corinne, meanwhile, tried to move on with her life. She told herself that she was better off without Delia, that some relationships were simply too broken to fix. But deep down, she missed her sister every single day. She missed the late-night talks, the shared laughter, the feeling of sitting side by side on that old piano bench. She had a family of her own now, children and grandchildren who brought her joy. But there was always an empty space in her heart that none of them could fill. 17 years is a long time. Long enough for children to grow up and start families of their own. Long enough for hair to turn gray and joints to grow stiff. Long enough for anger to fade into something quieter but no less painful. Both sisters had grown old carrying the weight of that one terrible argument, that one moment when pride had won over love. And yet, neither of them knew that everything was about to change. Because sometimes, healing comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, it takes a new generation to mend the wounds of the old. And sometimes, the very thing that tore a family apart can be the thing that brings them back. Together, the piano was still waiting. Corinne's grandson was 14 years old when he first started asking questions about the family. His name was Kian, a quiet boy with curious eyes and hands that were always moving. He had a habit of tapping rhythms on tables, on his knees, on anything within reach. Music lived inside him, even though no one in his immediate family played an instrument. His parents were busy people, working long hours to provide for the family, and there had never been time or money for piano lessons. But somehow, the love for music had found its way into his bones anyway. Kian was not the kind of boy who demanded attention. He preferred watching and listening over speaking. At school, he sat in the back of the classroom, observing his classmates and teachers with a thoughtful expression. He had a small group of friends, but he often felt like he did not quite fit in anywhere. There was something restless inside him, a feeling that there was more to life than what he could see on the surface. He just did not know what it was yet. One autumn afternoon, Kian's history teacher assigned a genealogy project. Each student was supposed to research their family tree, interview older relatives, and create a presentation about their heritage. Most of the kids groaned at the assignment, but Kian felt a spark of excitement. He had always been curious about where he came from. His grandmother Corinne rarely talked about the past, and whenever he asked questions, she would change the subject or give short, vague answers. Maybe this project would finally give him a reason to dig deeper. He started with his mother, asking her about the family history. She told him what she knew, which was not much. She talked about Corinne's childhood in Seattle, about how she had grown up in a small house with her sister and their mother. When Kian asked about the sister, his mother hesitated. She said there had been some kind of falling out years ago, before Kian was born, and that he should probably ask his grandmother if he wanted to know more. That evening, Kian went to visit Corinne. She lived alone now in a cozy apartment filled with houseplants and old books. Her husband had passed away a few years earlier, and she spent most of her days reading, watching birds from her window, and waiting for visits from her grandchildren. When Kian arrived, she greeted him with a warm hug and a plate of homemade cookies, just like she always did. They sat together in her small living room, and Kian explained the school project. Corinne smiled and began telling him stories about her childhood, about growing up in Seattle, about her parents and the little house she had lived in. But when Kian asked about her sister, her smile faded. She looked down at her hands, which were folded tightly in her lap, and said nothing for a long moment. Kian could feel the shift in the room. The air felt heavier, and his grandmother suddenly seemed older and more fragile. He almost told her to forget it, that it did not matter, but something stopped him. He had never seen her look like this before, and he wanted to understand why. Finally, Corinne let out a long breath. She told him that she did have a sister, an older sister named Delia, but that they had not spoken in many years. When Kian asked why, she shook her head slowly and said it was a painful story. She was not sure she was ready to tell it, but Kian was patient. He did not push or demand answers. He simply sat with her, holding her hand, letting her know that he was there. And eventually, piece by piece, the story came out. She told him about the piano, about their mother Hedgen, about the argument after the funeral and the court case that followed. She told him how one moment of anger had turned into 17 years of silence. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and Kian could see the tears forming in her eyes. When she finished, Kian did not know what to say. He had never imagined that his grandmother carried such a heavy burden. He had always seen her as strong and cheerful, the kind of person who could handle anything. But now he saw the cracks beneath the surface, the pain that she had been hiding for so long. That night, Kian could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the story his grandmother had told him. 17 years without speaking to her own sister. 17 years of missed birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments. It seemed like such a waste. And all because of a piano. He thought about his grandmother's face when she talked about Delia. There had been anger there, yes, but also something else. Something that looked a lot like longing. Kian wondered if Delia felt the same way. He wondered if she ever thought about Corinne, if she ever wished things had turned out differently. A few days later, Kian went to the public library to continue his research for the school project. He searched through old records and online databases, looking for information about his family. And that is when he found the photographs. They were scanned copies of old family pictures, uploaded to a genealogy website by some distant relative. Kian scrolled through them slowly, his heart beating faster with each image. There were pictures of his great-grandmother Hedgen as a young woman. There were pictures of the old family house in Seattle. And there, in one faded black and white photograph, were two little girls sitting side by side at a beautiful grand piano. Kian stared at the image for a long time. The girls looked so happy, their faces bright with innocent joy. They were leaning into each other, their shoulders touching, their smiles matching. He could not tell which one was Corinne and which one was Delia, but it did not matter. What mattered was what he saw in that picture. Love. Pure. Simple. Unbroken love. He printed out the photograph and took it home. For days, he kept it on his desk, looking at it every night before bed. The more he thought about it, the more he felt like he needed to do something. He could not just stand by and watch his grandmother carry this pain for the rest of her life. But what could a 14-year-old boy possibly do to fix a 17-year-old wound? Then an idea came to him. It was a crazy idea, the kind that made his stomach twist with nerves just thinking about it. But once it entered his mind, he could not shake it. He was going to find Delia. It took him 2 weeks of careful searching. He used the internet, public records, and a lot of patience. Finally, he found an address. Delia lived just 12 miles away, in a quiet neighborhood not far from the city. Kian's hands trembled as he wrote down the address. He knew that what he was about to do could change everything, for better or for worse. He decided to write a letter. It felt safer than showing up at her door unannounced. He sat at his desk for hours, trying to find the right words. How do you introduce yourself to a great-aunt you have never met? How do you explain that you want to help heal a wound that has been bleeding for almost 2 decades? In the end, he kept it simple. He wrote that his name was Kian, that he was Corinne's grandson, and that he had recently learned about the family history. He said he did not want to take sides or blame anyone. He just wanted to understand. And more than anything, he wanted to hear the piano that his great-grandmother had once played. He sealed the letter, walked to the post office, and dropped it in the mailbox before he could change his mind. Then he went home and waited. The days that followed were agonizing. Every time the phone rang or the mail arrived, his heart jumped. He did not tell anyone what he had done. Not his parents, not his grandmother. He was terrified that he had made a terrible mistake. That Delia would be angry, that he would only make things worse. But then, exactly 9 days after he sent the letter, a reply arrived. It was a short note, written in elegant handwriting on pale blue stationery. Delia thanked him for reaching out. She said she had thought about Corinne every single day for the past 17 years. She said she would be honored to meet him and to show him the piano. Kian read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. He did not know what would happen next. He did not know if this would lead to healing or more heartbreak. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something that had been missing from his family for years. He felt hope. The first time Kian stood outside Delia's house, his legs felt like they might give out. It was a Saturday morning in late October, and the air was crisp with the smell of fallen leaves. The house was a modest 2-story home with a small garden out front and white curtains in the windows. It looked warm and inviting, but Kian's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He had told his parents he was going to a friend's house to work on a school project. It was not exactly a lie, but it was not the whole truth either. He felt guilty about the secret, but he did not know how else to do this. If he told his grandmother what he was planning, she might try to stop him. And he could not let that happen. Something deep inside him said that this was the right thing to do. He walked up the path to the front door and rang the bell. For a moment, there was silence. Then he heard footsteps, slow and careful, coming closer. The door opened, and there she was. Delia was 73 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a soft bun and gentle lines around her eyes. She wore a simple blue cardigan and a pearl necklace that looked like it had been worn 1,000 times before. But what struck Kian the most was her expression. She looked at him with a mixture of wonder and sorrow, as if she was seeing a ghost. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Delia smiled, and her whole face seemed to soften. She said his name quietly, almost like a question. He nodded, and she stepped aside to let him in. The inside of the house was warm and filled with the scent of jasmine tea. There were photographs on every wall, pictures of children and grandchildren, of holidays and ordinary days. But Kian barely noticed any of it. His eyes went straight to the living room, where the piano stood against the far wall. It was the most beautiful instrument he had ever seen. The wood was a deep, rich brown, polished until it gleamed. The keys were slightly yellowed with age, just like his grandmother had described. And even though no one was playing it, Kian could almost hear the music it held inside. Delia watched him as he approached the piano. She did not say anything, just let him take it in. When he finally reached out and touched one of the keys, pressing it down gently, the note that rang out was clear and warm, like a voice from another time. He turned to look at her, and she had tears in her eyes. She told him to sit down, and she made him tea. They sat together in the living room, the piano waiting silently beside them, and she began to talk. She told him things she had never told anyone, not even her own children. She told him about the guilt she had carried for 17 years, the sleepless nights, the letters she had written but never sent. She told him how many times she had picked up the phone to call Corinne, only to put it down again because she did not know what to say. She said she had been stubborn and proud. She admitted that she had said hurtful things during that terrible argument, things she wished she could take back. But by the time she realized how wrong she had been, too much time had passed. The wall between them had grown so high that she did not know how to climb over it anymore. Kian listened without interrupting. He could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain he had seen in his grandmother's eyes when she told her side of the story. It struck him then that both women had been suffering in the same way, carrying the same regret, longing for the same reconciliation. They were mirrors of each other, separated by pride and silence. When Delia finished talking, she looked at him and asked why he had come. What did he hope to find? Kian thought carefully before answering. He said he was not sure exactly. He just knew that families should not be broken like this. He knew that his grandmother missed her sister, even if she would never admit it. And he knew that the piano, the thing that had torn them apart, was also the thing that connected them. It was their mother's legacy, a piece of her that still lived in the world. Maybe, he said quietly, it could bring them back together. Delia stared at him for a long time. Then she asked if he wanted to learn to play. Kian's heart leaped. He nodded eagerly, and Delia smiled for the first time since he had arrived. She stood up, walked over to the piano, and sat down on the bench. She patted the space beside her, inviting him to join. That afternoon, she taught him his first piece. It was a simple melody, just a few notes strung together, but to Kian it felt like magic. His fingers fumbled at first, hitting wrong keys and stumbling over the rhythm. But Delia was patient. She guided his hands gently, showed him how to curve his fingers, how to feel the music instead of just playing it. By the end of the lesson, he could play the melody from start to finish without mistakes. He went back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that. Each week, he told his parents the same story about the school project. Each week, he took the bus across town to Delia's house and spent hours at the piano with her. She taught him scales and chords, simple songs, and more complex pieces. She told him stories about his great-grandmother Hedgen, about the music she used to play, about the way her fingers danced across the keys like they were made of air. As the weeks passed, something began to change in Kian. The restlessness he had always felt inside him started to quiet. When he sat at the piano, everything else faded away. There was only the music, the notes flowing through him like water. He finally understood what his grandmother and great-aunt had felt all those years ago, why the piano meant so much to them. It was not just an instrument. It was a language, a way of expressing things that words could never capture. But even as Kian grew closer to Delia, the secret weighed on him. He hated lying to his family. He hated sneaking around like he was doing something wrong. More than once, he almost told his grandmother the truth. But every time he opened his mouth, fear stopped him. What if she was angry? What if she felt betrayed? What if this made everything worse instead of better? One evening, after a particularly long lesson, Delia sat him down and looked at him with serious eyes. She said she was grateful for these months together, more grateful than he could ever know. Meeting him had given her something she thought she had lost forever. But she also knew that this could not go on in secret. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and it would be better if they controlled how it happened. She asked him if he had a plan. Kian admitted that he did not. He had been so focused on learning the piano and getting to know her that he had not thought about what came next. But now, sitting in her living room with the winter light fading outside, he realized that the time had come. He had to find a way to bring the two sisters together. He just did not know how. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Then Kian remembered something. His school was holding a winter piano recital in a few weeks. Students could sign up to perform in front of their families. He had been practicing a special piece, something Delia had taught him. It was a melody that Hejin had composed herself, a song that both sisters would recognize from their childhood. An idea began to form in his mind. It was risky. It could backfire terribly. But it was also the only chance he might ever have. He looked at Delia and told her about the recital. He asked if she would be willing to come. She hesitated, already sensing where this was going. Then he told her the rest of the plan. He would invite his grandmother too, without telling either of them that the other would be there. He would play the song their mother wrote, the song that belonged to both of them. And maybe, just maybe, the music would do what words could not. Delia was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. She said it was time. The night before the recital, Kian could not eat his dinner. His mother asked if he was feeling sick, and he shook his head and pushed the food around his plate. His stomach was twisted into knots, and every time he thought about what was going to happen the next day, his hands started to shake. He had never been so nervous in his entire life. He had practiced the piece 100 times. He knew every note, every pause, every gentle shift in rhythm. Delia had helped him perfect it over the past few weeks, sitting beside him at the piano bench, guiding his hands, correcting his posture. She said he was ready. She said his great-grandmother would have been proud. But knowing the notes was one thing. Playing them in front of a room full of people, with his grandmother and great-aunt sitting in the audience without knowing the other was there, was something else entirely. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible outcome in his mind. What if his grandmother saw Delia and walked out before he even started playing? What if Delia changed her mind and did not show up at all? What if the music was not enough to heal 17 years of silence? What if he made everything worse? But there was no turning back now. The invitations had been sent. His grandmother had promised to come. Delia had promised too. Whatever happened tomorrow, at least he would know that he tried. The morning of the recital was cold and gray. A thin layer of frost covered the ground, and the sky looked like it might snow at any moment. Kian got dressed slowly, his fingers fumbling with the buttons on his shirt. His mother helped him straighten his collar and told him how proud she was. His father clapped him on the shoulder and said he could not wait to hear him play. They had no idea what was really about to happen. The recital was held in the school auditorium, a large room with wooden floors and tall windows that let in pale winter light. Rows of folding chairs had been set up for the families, and a grand piano stood on a small stage at the front. It was not as beautiful as the Steinway in Delia's living room, but it had a decent sound. And Kian had practiced on it several times during rehearsals. He arrived early and sat backstage with the other students who were performing. Some of them were chatting nervously. Others were doing last-minute practice on their instruments. Kian sat alone in the corner, his eyes closed, his fingers moving silently in his lap as he ran through the piece one more time in his head. The auditorium began to fill up. He could hear the murmur of voices, the scraping of chairs, the rustle of coats being removed. His heart beat faster with every passing minute. He peeked through the curtain and scanned the audience, looking for familiar faces. He spotted his parents first. They were sitting near the middle of the room, saving a seat for his grandmother. A few minutes later, he saw Corinne walk in. She was wearing her favorite green coat, the one she always wore to special occasions. She looked happy, smiling as she greeted his parents and took her seat. She had no idea what was coming. Then, just as the recital was about to begin, the back door of the auditorium opened. Kian's breath caught in his throat. Dahlia stepped inside, wrapped in a gray wool coat, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a small hat. She paused at the entrance, her eyes scanning the crowd. For a moment, she looked uncertain, like she might turn around and leave. But then she straightened her shoulders and walked to an empty seat near the back of the room. She had not seen Corinne yet. Corinne had not seen her. The two sisters were sitting in the same room for the first time in 17 years, and neither one knew it. The recital began. One by one, students walked onto the stage, performed their pieces, and walked off to polite applause. A girl played a classical violin solo. A boy performed a jazz number on the saxophone. A pair of twins played a duet on two guitars. Kian barely heard any of it. His mind was focused entirely on what was coming. Finally, it was his turn. His name was called, and he stood up on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. He walked onto the stage, the lights warm on his face, the audience a blur of shapes and colors. He sat down at the piano and placed his fingers on the keys. For a moment, he just sat there, breathing, trying to calm the wild beating of his heart. He looked out at the audience. He found his grandmother first, sitting in the middle row, her face glowing with anticipation. Then he looked toward the back and found Delia, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes already glistening. He took one last breath. And then he began to play. The first notes floated out into the silence like drops of rain on still water. The melody was soft and gentle, a simple tune that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 memories. It was the song that Hejin had composed decades ago, the song she used to play for her daughters every night before bed. It was a lullaby, a love letter, a promise wrapped in music. Kian played with everything he had. He let his fingers move without thinking, let the music flow through him like it had a life of its own. He thought about his great-grandmother, a woman he had never met but felt like he knew through the stories and the songs. He thought about the two little girls in the photograph, sitting side by side at the piano, their whole lives ahead of them. He thought about 17 years of silence, of stubborn pride, of love that had been buried but never destroyed. The melody swelled and softened, rose and fell, like the breath of something ancient and beautiful. And somewhere in the middle of the piece, Kian heard a sound that made his heart stop, a gasp. Then another. He did not look up. He kept playing, his fingers steady even as his eyes blurred with tears. But he knew what had happened. Corinne had recognized the song. She had turned around in her seat, searching for the source of a feeling she could not explain. And she had seen Delia, sitting in the back row, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The music continued, but the world around it went still. The two sisters stared at each other across the crowded room, 17 years of pain and longing passing between them in a single glance. Corinne's hand flew to her mouth. Her shoulders began to shake. She looked like she wanted to stand up, to run, to scream, to do something, anything. But she stayed in her seat, held there by the music, by the memory, by the sight of the sister she had lost so long ago. Delia did not look away. She held Corinne's gaze, her own tears falling freely now. Her lips moved, forming words that no one could hear. Maybe it was an apology. Maybe it was a prayer. Maybe it was simply her sister's name, spoken for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Kian played the final notes of the song. The last chord hung in the air, soft and trembling, like a question waiting to be answered. Then there was silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The audience seemed unsure whether to clap, sensing that something important was happening, but not understanding what. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started as a scattered ripple and grew into a warm wave of sound. But Kian was not listening to the applause. He was watching his grandmother rise from her seat. He was watching her turn toward the back of the room. He was watching her take one step, then another, moving toward Delia like she was being pulled by an invisible thread. Delia stood up too. She stepped into the aisle, her arms already opening. Her face crumpled with emotion. And then, in the middle of that crowded auditorium, surrounded by strangers and family and the fading echo of their mother's music, the two sisters finally found each other again. Corinne fell into Delia's arms. Delia held her tight, so tight it looked like she would never let go. They stood there, crying and trembling, whispering words that only they could hear. Kian watched from the stage, his hands still resting on the keys. His own tears were falling now, but he did not wipe them away. He just sat there, taking it all in, feeling the weight of what he had done settle into his chest like something warm and bright. He had not known if it would work. He had not known if music could really heal a wound that deep. But watching his grandmother and great-aunt hold each other, watching 17 years of silence break apart like ice in the spring, he finally understood. Some things are stronger than pride. Some things are stronger than time. And sometimes, all it takes is one song to remind people of what truly matters. The piano had done its work. Now the healing could begin. The auditorium slowly emptied, but the two sisters did not move. They stood in the aisle, holding each other, their bodies shaking with sobs that had been waiting 17 years to escape. The other families gathered their children and their coats, glancing at the two elderly women with curiosity and quiet respect. Something sacred was happening, and everyone seemed to sense it. Kian's parents stood frozen near their seats, confusion written all over their faces. His mother looked at him with wide eyes, silently asking for an explanation. But Kian just shook his head gently and stepped down from the stage. This moment did not belong to him. It belonged to them. When the room was nearly empty, Corinne finally pulled back. She held Delia at arm's length, her hands gripping her sister's shoulders like she was afraid she might disappear. Her face was red and wet with tears, her voice barely a whisper when she spoke. She said she was sorry. She said she had been stubborn and foolish. She said she had wasted so many years holding on to anger when all she really wanted was her sister back. Delia shook her head and said no. She was the one who should apologize. She had been proud and cold. She had said terrible things that she did not mean. She had let a piece of furniture, no matter how precious, destroy the most important relationship in her life. They stood there, trading apologies like gifts, each one trying to take more of the blame. And then, somewhere in the middle of it all, they started to laugh. It was a strange, tearful kind of laughter, the kind that comes when pain and joy mix together in ways you cannot separate. They laughed at themselves, at the years they had lost, at the absurdity of two grown women fighting over a piano, while their mother's memories slipped further and further away. Kian watched from a distance, a small smile on his face. His mother came up beside him and put her arm around his shoulders. She asked him how long he had been planning this. He told her the truth, all of it, from the letter he had written to the secret piano lessons to the plan for the recital. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from surprise to wonder to something that looked a lot like pride. When he finished, She pulled him into a tight hug. She said she could not believe what he had done. She said he was braver than anyone she knew. And then she said something that made his heart swell. She said his great-grandmother Hedgen would have been so proud of him. That evening, the whole family gathered at Delia's house. It was the first time in nearly 2 decades that both sides of the family had been in the same room. There were cousins who had never met, aunts and uncles who had only heard stories about each other, grandchildren who did not know they had more relatives just a few miles away. The house was crowded and noisy and full of a kind of chaotic warmth that felt like home. Corinne walked through the front door slowly, her eyes moving over every corner of her sister's house. When she saw the piano in the living room, she stopped. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the instrument that had caused so much pain. Then she walked over to it, ran her fingers along the smooth wood, and sat down on the bench. She pressed a single key, and the note rang out clear and true. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time she was smiling. She said it still sounded the same. She said it still sounded like their mother. Delia sat down beside her, just like they used to when they were little girls. Their shoulders touched, their hands rested on the keys, and for a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then, without speaking, they began to play together. It was not a perfect performance. Their fingers stumbled over notes they had forgotten, and the rhythm was uneven in places. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that they were playing again, side by side, the way they had done a lifetime ago. The music filled the house, drifting into every room, wrapping around everyone who heard it like a warm blanket. Kian stood in the doorway and watched. His chest felt tight with emotion, but it was a good kind of tight. The kind that comes when something broken finally gets fixed. In the weeks that followed, the two sisters began to rebuild their relationship piece by piece. It was not easy. 17 years of silence had left deep scars, and there were moments when old hurts bubbled up to the surface. But they kept trying. They called each other every few days. They met for coffee and long walks. They shared stories about their children and grandchildren, catching up on all the years they had missed. They talked about their mother often. They remembered the way she used to hum while she cooked, the way she would tuck them into bed and kiss their foreheads, the way her hands moved across the piano keys like they were dancing. Sharing those memories helped them heal. It reminded them that their bond was older and stronger than any argument. One afternoon, about 2 months after the recital, Delia invited Corinne over for tea. When Corinne arrived, she found her sister sitting at the piano with a serious expression on her face. Delia said she had been thinking about something for a long time, and she had finally made a decision. She said the piano should not belong to just one of them. It had always been meant to bring them together, not tear them apart. So she proposed a new arrangement. The piano would move between their homes, spending 1 year with Delia and the next year with Corinne. That way, they would both have time with it, and neither one would have to say goodbye forever. Corinne's eyes filled with tears. She said it was the perfect solution. She said their mother would have loved the idea. They sealed the agreement with a hug and a duet, playing one of Hedgen's favorite songs together. The music floated out through the open window, carried on the winter breeze, as if their mother was listening from somewhere far away. As for Kian, he continued his piano lessons. But now, instead of learning in secret, he practiced openly, sometimes at Delia's house and sometimes at Corinne's. Both sisters took turns teaching him, passing on everything they knew, everything their mother had taught them. He soaked it all up like a sponge, his love for music growing deeper with every lesson. He never forgot the day of the recital. He never forgot the way the music had filled the auditorium, the way his grandmother had turned and seen her sister, the way 17 years of pain had melted away in a single embrace. It had changed something inside him. It had shown him that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. that love was stronger than pride, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply try. Years later, when Kian was a young man studying music at a university across the country, he would tell people the story of the piano. He would tell them about his great-grandmother Hejin, about the two sisters who had lost and found each other, about the winter recital that had changed everything. And whenever he sat down to play, he carried all of them with him. Their love, their pain, their forgiveness, their hope. The old Steinway still moved between the two homes, just as the sisters had agreed. It had grown even more worn with age. Its keys yellowed, its wood faded. But it still played beautifully, and every time someone pressed the keys, the music that came out was filled with history. Corinne and Delia spent their final years closer than ever. They made up for lost time as best they could, filling their days with laughter and shared meals and long conversations about everything and nothing. When they finally passed, within a year of each other, they left behind a family that was whole again, and the piano remained. It stood in the corner of the living room, waiting for the next pair of hands, the next generation, the next song. Because that is what music does. It outlasts the people who play it. It carries their stories forward, long after they are gone, whispering to anyone who will listen. Some things are stronger than time. Some bonds can never truly be broken. And sometimes, all it takes to heal the deepest wounds is a single song, played with love, in a room full of people who finally remember what matters most: family, forgiveness, and the music that holds it all together.